Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Welcome back. I'm your host, Paul Barter. Today I have Shreya Gadepalli on the show, and she was actually our very first guest in the Reinventing Parking podcast, so it's great to have her back. She is one of India's foremost urban mobility experts, and she leads the Urban Works Institute, an Indian think and do tank that helps cities create safe and engaging public spaces and develop green and inclusive mobility solutions. She is the founder emeritus of the India program of the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, ITDP, which she launched in the late 1990s and built into an impactful program over 2 decades. So today I want to talk with Shreya about parking policy reform in India, but in particular, I'd like to talk to her about something that she and I have been working on together in a way, or tag teaming on, which is the parking management game, which it started out as something that I devised maybe, it's about 8 years ago now, I guess, for my classes and for my trainings on parking. And perhaps before we go into what happens, Shreya, can you tell? Well, first of all, hello, Shreya. How are you?
Hi, Paul. Yeah, it's fantastic to be back on this podcast. And thanks for having me as the first person on the podcast many, many years back. And it was fun talking to you then, as is always. So happy to be here.
Let's dive into the game, where I would give participants a piece of paper with a little pretend map of a commercial area surrounded by streets and with some streets in the middle, and surrounded by residential areas also with streets. And there's a very small number of on-street parking spaces marked P, and a smallish number of off-street parking spaces in the area. And the activity doesn't give the game players very much choice, or at least the way I used to play it. They're not allowed to change their mode of transport. They're not allowed to really do much, except as we go through the game, we simulate a morning. And I tell them 3 cars arrive with employees working in the area. And what the game players get to do is choose where those cars will park. And they kind of have a godlike eagle's view of the whole area. So a little unlike a real motorist who has to search at ground level, they can see where the parking spaces are and they can just choose them. And we just run through a morning, and I tell them, 3 people have arrived to have their breakfast, or 2 people have arrived for work a little later, or several people have arrived for shopping. Okay, and so it goes on. And I think it ends around 1:30 p.m. or 2 p.m. And we run it twice, or this is the way I used to do it, and Shreya can tell us how they do it now with Urban Works, because they've adapted the game and made it much more user-friendly and visually interesting. And so we run it twice, once with, frankly, horrible parking management, but in the second run, we introduce parking fees that are quite high for the on-street parking. Oh, sorry, by the way, in the unmanaged case, the off-street parking has fees, but the on-street parking doesn't. So then in the second run with the parking management, the off-street parking still has the same fees as it did before, but the on-street prime spaces close to the shops, close to the offices, have the highest parking fee per hour, and some other on-street parking is free of charge further out. So that's how we used to play it. How did it come about that you picked up this game and you've been using it in the trainings?
Yeah, and first of all, thanks a lot for the initial thinking that you did, Paul, in developing the game, the first prototype. What we managed to do was essentially to make it a little more user-friendly, if you will. So the basic structure of the game remains pretty much the same as what you had envisaged. What we did was to create these small little cars which people can park, and how they know when to come in, when to go out. And so the process has been streamlined, and we have these small little flashcards to announce when they're coming, what they're doing. And in the hands of a good conductor, it can become a very engaging game, a funny game, but a very engaging game, which really gets across the point of why we need to manage parking.
That's great because I remember when I was first doing it, it was a little clumsy, and my mind was very preoccupied in just getting it right, getting through the mechanics of it, and it worked best in some of the cities where I did it, such as Pune actually, and in Colombia a couple of times. And we had people from nonprofits who were facilitating at the various tables, and so they were smoothing the path and explaining and helping people with their dilemmas. And I could hear lots of laughter, so it was very funny. Let's talk about how it typically goes, because it doesn't always go exactly the same, but there is a broad pattern to how it goes, and it sends a message. Do you want to sort of talk through that quickly?
Sure, certainly. You already described how the game basically is structured, where it's a morning, people come between 8 to 1, broadly speaking, 8 to 12:30. So about 4.5 hours. They arrive at different times, they leave at different times. Some of them are not leaving at all because they're going to stay on till the evening because they are either shopkeepers or office goers. And then there are others who are coming in for maybe an hour to eat or shop and so on and so forth. I find the physical activity very engaging. So, we've considered maybe gamifying this as a online game or an electronic version. But I think the physical act of actually placing one's card on a board is completely different. So it changes how people perceive the problem. So there's a single announcer. I typically am the announcer. But like you said, we typically have a facilitator or two on each board who helps, guides people. And this has been working really well. And it's been quite an eye-opener for them to realize that their own behavior is very different when the context changes ever so slightly. Not a huge deal, but ever so slightly, right? And oftentimes, what we do is in the workshops, we have a varied group of people. So we have public officials, say municipal engineers, but also police staff who are key to parking management, along with some practitioners like consultants who work with cities, and sometimes even students and academia. So it's a nice bunch to interact with. It's typically part of a day-long workshop, of which this runs for about an hour, hour and a half. So the game itself takes about 45 minutes to an hour, and then about half an hour of discussion thereafter. And like you said, there are two rounds. We have off-street parking, which have two levels of rates. One is prime off-street parking, like a multi-level car park right in the center. And then there's off-street parking, which is slightly farther off, which is on a parking lot. Some private person might just open up their unused parking plot to become a parking lot. And we're seeing more and more that something like this is happening in Indian cities. I was discussing this with my colleagues recently, who told me about how there are people with open parking, like unused plots of land, who are turning them into temporary parking spaces because there's money to be made, right? So this is actually happening in real life as well.
So what happens towards the end of that first round? What's the situation on the board?
So, very interestingly, what happens at the end of the first round is that the entire parking space is badly utilized. So there is an excessive demand for on-street parking because it's free. And because the enforcement is weak, even spots where they should not be parking, such as at intersections, also get occupied, while the off-street parking is barely used. That's part one.
Yes. Let's just pause there for a moment, Shreya, because I seem to remember some of the most hilarious moments in the game is when the very first person decides, I'm going to risk it and park on the street illegally at the intersection or in an illegal spot, and then everyone feels very naughty and giggles, and it's quite fun. Yeah.
Exactly. And many times you've seen police folks who are playing the game do that. Just put a car in a no parking spot, and it's hilarious. Everybody just bursts out laughing, saying, even police does that when they know they're not going to be caught.
And even at this stage of the game, like even if something happens, there's a blackout, and if you have to stop at that point, there's already this learning that, okay, with unmanaged parking, the off-street parking was there, but it's empty. So we've already sort of perhaps challenged the idea that there's a shortage of parking in this area. But then the next round is even more eye-opening.
That's right. But no, there's not in the first round itself, because not only is the off-street parking empty or more or less empty, and on-street is completely overflowing, uh, the on-street is fully occupied by long-term parkers, people who are shopkeepers and
Yes.
office goers, while the paid off-street parking, which is slightly less desirable because there's the act of actually having to go and park the vehicle in a parking facility, uh, is used by short-term parkers because they have no option but to park there. So this also drives home the point that the idea that somehow parking is required for shops to succeed is questioned, because that prime parking space is actually taken away by the shopkeepers rather than the shoppers.
That's an important message as well. Yeah. So again, the skilled facilitators can bring out these messages as you go along. Yeah.
Exactly. So that these are the 2 points that I actually bring out at the end of round 1, and then we quickly rearrange the game, and within 5 minutes they're up and running, playing the game again. And in the second round, what we do is 2 changes. First, on-street parking is charged, and it is charged higher than off-street parking. Typically, the prices that we've had is, let me just look at the prices. Right. So in the first round, what we do typically is that parking in parking structures, prime parking structures, is 20 rupees. Parking lots, which are slightly farther off, is 10 rupees. There is a steep fine, and oftentimes there is steep fine on paper, but there's poor enforcement. That's the first round. So in the second round, what we do is we add a price for on-street parking, and that happens to be 30 rupees. So that's 10 rupees more than the multi-level car parking, which is there. And there's fine, which is lower than the first round, but there is better enforcement. There's a higher chance of enforcement. And in this round, suddenly you see a change in how the same set of people play the game. And a bunch of things happen. First, nobody parks in the no parking areas. And interestingly, we have this funny exercise of also bringing in the police every once in a while during the play. Like one of the flashcards is a police person coming to check. So a couple of times during the second game round, there's enforcement that turns up, and we ask people to shell out money for having parked wrongly. So it's a fun exercise. Now, sort of back to the game. Now, what you see in the second round is that all the long-term parking moves into off-street parking structures or parking lots. The first of them to be filled are the parking lots, which are distant. Second are these multi-level car parking, which are in a more prime location. And you see more or less no long-term parking happening on the street. So it entirely opens up the on-street parking for short-term parking, such as people who are coming in for breakfast or coming in for shopping or lunch or whatever else it is that they come for. And this is something that the players immediately get as to what's happening, the behavior that they have, right? And this is great because this drives home the point that when you start introducing price for on-street parking and there's a certain amount of enforcement, there are 3 things that happen. First, that MLCPs, as they're called in India, multi-level car parking, and parking lots are better utilized, which means that the private sector, which typically runs such services, are now making money. So there's better business that they have because of better utilization of the stocks that they have. 2, long-term parkers vacate prime parking spots on the streets. And 3, short-term parkers now don't waste time finding parking on the street. It's much easier for them to find parking.
Yes, that's a powerful point as well, which I think is also powerful because that's one of the usual objections to even on-street parking fees for the purpose of parking management is we can't do this in our city because we don't have good public transport. So the fact that happens and they can see They
Mhm.
didn't have it.
Mhm.
We didn't even give them the choice of changing their mode. It was just where to park.
But the last point here also is that the government, even though the intent is not to make money, the government is also making money on that on-street parking, which they can use to improve walking and cycling and public transport
Yes.
facilities in the area. Right? I think this is important that even though the intent of parking management is not to make money, but it is a good revenue source and a substantial revenue source from our understanding to improve walking, cycling, and public transport facilities.
Yeah.
Uh,
Can I ask
hmm,
a question? The prime on-street price you said was 30 rupees per hour, which is around US 40 cents, I guess. Was
makes
it
sense.
trial
That's
and
right.
error to get there?
So, it's interesting that you asked this. Partly trial and error, but also we did a very interesting study over the last 1.5 years on looking at parking reforms in Indian cities, especially focusing on off-street
Mhm.
parking reform, as to what would get off-street parking to be an entirely
Mm.
private enterprise. So whether or not you institute parking maximums, at the very least reducing parking minimums and leaving it to the market to make the supply of parking is a key question to ask as to what would it take for that to happen. And we did a multi-city study. We read up on the existing parking statutes which are there in multiple states in India. We looked at what's actually happening on the ground in terms of parking management in multiple cities across India. And finally, we did an in-depth study in two cities. One was Surat in Gujarat, and the other one was Pimpri Chinchwad, which is the northern
Mhm.
suburb of Pune, as a separate municipal corporation. And we had some very, very interesting results. One of those results was we looked at willingness to pay for both cars as well as two-wheelers. We looked at willingness to pay for short-term parking as well as long-term parking, and some fantastic results that came out. One was that in both the cities, people were willing to pay very conveniently 20 rupees per hour. So 90% of all the people who were surveyed said, we are happy to pay 20 rupees per hour for parking. And this was especially more in areas where parking was more restricted, both on street and off street. The supply was restricted. So the more the restriction on supply, the greater the willingness to pay. That's one thing that we found. And two,
Uh-huh.
that nearly 100%, like I said, were willing to pay 20 rupees per hour, even though the city was only charging 10 rupees per hour at a few locations.
Mm.
So clearly, the city was not charging what the people were
Interesting.
willing to pay, right? Now, what we also found that over half of the people were willing to pay 40 rupees per hour.
Okay.
So the willingness to pay did not drop down to very low numbers by doubling the fee from 20 to 40. And so that's also interesting that there is enough demand for a higher priced parking if it's more convenient
Mm.
to users.
Yeah.
So that's the reason why we actually pegged the prices at the 10, 20, and 40 and 30. So we could very easily go to even 40 because people are willing to even pay 40 rupees from what we've surveyed in cities. And this is for four-wheelers or cars. And the numbers were very similar for two-wheelers. Even though two-wheelers or scooters and motorcycles occupy only around a fifth of the space for parking of cars, their willingness to pay was much higher. So again, the numbers were that 80% were willing to pay 10 rupees per hour for two-wheeler parking. And an interesting thing that we found out was that if an entirely private enterprise, which is the land is private, the structure is private, and the entire cost of operations and everything is taken into account, the cost of running a parking facility for motorcycles will break even at 12 rupees per hour, even assuming very, very low levels of occupancy.
Gosh. Yeah. It's interesting. With on street, it's 5 motorcycles per car space with small motorcycles, but off street, it's actually even more because the aisles can
That's
be
right.
narrow. So, did you take that into account
That's
in
right.
that calculation?
We did a calculation using just 5 as the number right now, just to be optimistic. But if we actually were to go to 8, then this number is going to drop to 10. So people are willing, like I said, 80% of people are willing to pay 10 rupees an hour, which is the market price for parking right now. as far as two-wheelers are concerned.
Is this going to be a scandal, Shreya? Is Urban Works Institute about to go out and invest in motorcycle parking as an investment to cross-subsidize your activities?
Who knows? As of now, we are a non-profit organization, but maybe we should start a for-profit. An interesting model for funding non-profits is to start managing parking. How about that?
Yes. By the way, can people, is that study public yet? The big study that you mentioned just now?
We have, as in we're cleaning up the report right now, but the principal ideas are already out. Happy to share a presentation about the findings that we have with graphs, etc., of what the willingness to pay was. There's a whole bunch of other things that we did in the study, of course, looking at a study of statutes as to what's happening in Indian cities and what should be done, etc. But yeah, this report should be out soon.
Okay, we can share that with the listener who may want to click through and read some of that stuff. That's great.
Sure. We're also happy to share the formats for surveys that we used because we did that through a lot of trial and error. We did multiple rounds of testing of the survey form itself, and then trained surveyors to be able to interview people to get out information from them. So that's something that others might want to use.
So could I ask about the reaction afterwards? Have you had feedback from participants that they got the message on the day? Does the message sink in and they continue to get that message? And do you see any evidence that it's helping with policy change?
Indeed. So, after we did this study, we also conducted 2 state-level workshops. One in Gujarat for all the cities, all the municipal corporations of Gujarat. And this was in association with the state government as well as the Gujarat Institute of Civil Engineers and Architects. So we had practitioners and we had municipal corporations and we had police participating in this workshop, a day-long workshop. And it was an eye-opener for them because not only did they play the game, but we also showed them the data that we got through surveys and what the learnings from it could be and what this way forward could be. And I'm happy to share that Ahmedabad, the largest of the cities in Gujarat, is now going forward with a citywide parking management planning process to take this work forward in Gujarat. And similarly, in Pimpri-Chinchwad, we also organized a state-level workshop where we had participants, planners from mid-sized and large cities of the state of Maharashtra who participated again in a day-long workshop. And the support was immense and they really got the point and they have been interested. So we've gotten interest from both the state urban planning unit as well as the city of Pimpri-Chinchwad, which is interested in taking this work forward in a pan-city fashion.
Wonderful. That's very gratifying that it's helping. And we can't necessarily claim credit for the game because it happens in the context of training sessions where you ram various parking reform messages home. But I like to think that perhaps the parking game helped as well.
It does. Because the parking game is the first thing that we put across because it really opens up the mind of people. And then after the game is done, that's when we present the data to substantiate that what they learned is actually what even everyone else in the city is saying. And then what do you do about it? Now that you know what people are willing to do, how do you go about reforming parking?
And I guess that's important, isn't it? Because the game, I mean, as it is presented, is very unrealistic, right? There's just a few parking spaces, there's no motorcycles, etc.
I don't think the game is unrealistic. You might say that it's simple, but it's not unrealistic of the realities on the ground because people really connect with what they've seen on the ground after they play the game. But they've never come to the conclusions that the game helps them come to.
So what I'm hoping in a way is that listeners out there will be thinking to themselves, how can I get my hands on this game and how can I start to use it in training people in my own country, my own city? Is there any mechanism by which Urban Works might be willing to share the essentials of the game?
Sure. We could put this out on our website, the board. So something that's printable, the board as well as the flashcards and the car units that we have. And, people anywhere should be able to print this out and start playing the game wherever they are. So one last thing that I wanted to share is we also looked at, what people would do if they had to purchase parking separately, that if parking was not bundled with their residence. with their apartment when they buy it, and what they would do if it was charged for separately as a piece of real estate, which really what it is. Parking is a piece of real estate. And that charge was realistic in terms of what it actually costs to create that, including the FAR, the floor area ratio, essentially the cost of the land also. It turns out to be something like about 25% of the cost of the house, like 25% more about the cost of the apartment. And if parking was charged at additional over the cost of the apartment, what we found was very interesting. We found that over 40% of people said that they are willing to live a car-free life. This is fascinating, right? Despite the whole imagination that people cannot just leave their car, 43% in Surat said that they will actually live a car-free life. And another 42% said that they would go to a cheaper but less desirable location to buy a house of the same size, but with parking. So, those were the two sides of the coin. And of course, we had two other options, which was buy a smaller house, essentially with, say, one less bedroom, but with one parking space. So this was also bringing in the equivalence of saying, essentially, you are, deciding between having an extra bedroom or an extra parking slot. And so of the remaining 50% that was there, it was divided between either buying a smaller house, but with parking. And finally, like a very small percentage said that they would increase their budget for the house itself, that they would pay that initial amount for parking and the house that they want.
Interesting. I was in Dhaka recently looking at parking, and I didn't do any formal survey, but I did ask everyone I met about their home-based parking situation. And most of the sort of middle income and upper middle income people I met live in apartment buildings in Dhaka. And almost all of them said that there were some people who had parking with their apartment, but that there was a secondary market. Not every apartment had parking, and those who lacked parking but needed some would rent it from someone who did have some. There were a surprising number of people in Dhaka are renting parking in another building near their home. Is it common in Indian cities to have any unbundling of parking, or not yet?
It is turning out to be quite common where people are renting out their parking spaces. An interesting thing that we found is that in many places, shopkeepers are renting out the curbside for parking to long-term parkers.
Oh dear.
That's public parking space, and there's a market clearly, and somebody's captured that market. Yes. Isn't that fantastic?
Yes.
So this is what happens. There's money to be made, and that's going into private hands rather than the public hand. The price varies, of course, depending on the city, but in most cities, that price is somewhere in the range of about 5,000 to 7,000 rupees a month.
Gosh.
So that's a little under $100 a month.
That's a really significant unbundled price. So just to end, Shreya, we were very, very hopeful that Chennai,
That's
where
right.
you are, I think, in South India, in Tamil Nadu, was on the cusp of doing some wonderful things.
That's right.
Have they been able to follow through, or have they had some setbacks?
So, in Chennai, they implemented parking management. There were again some technical issues, not so much an understanding or an agreement with the principle, but there were some technical issues. Having said that, the city, Chennai, as well as many other cities, are implementing publicly funded parking structures, which is unfortunate. And that one of the main points that we've been pushing for is that the government need not be and should not be building parking structures. And what they should be doing is to facilitate a move towards privately owned and managed parking structures. Now, the good news is that the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs of the national government, of the central government, has gotten this point. And recently, I was invited to present these ideas to over 700 planners from cities across India. Nearly 100 cities from across India came to participate. And they all learned about the findings of the study, the parking game, and the principles of what needs to be done. And a clear message has gone out from the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs that they are not going to fund any parking structures, which previously they were willing to. So now they are not willing to put national money into cities' parking
And even the
structures.
cities themselves have been disappointed, right? I saw you were quoted in one of these articles about Chennai, and the city was dismayed that they'd built this structure and it was mostly empty. They were not recovering anywhere near the cost, and they
That's
had
right.
lowered the price in the hope of enticing
That's
people.
right.
They were about to ban parking within 500 meters of the whole of the thing, in the hope of enticing people in. And I haven't heard whether that worked, but yes, disappointment. Has Chennai been able to use the parking app to charge fees in the street? Has that gone ahead, or was that one of the technical issues you were?
So Chennai did, go forward with a technically advanced solution, but there were lots of issues with the technology
Wow.
itself, and therefore, there were problems in implementation. Eventually, that was called off, and they're thinking about doing something afresh. But I think one side that we often overlook is even after the city understands the principle, there is much to be done in getting it to be
Yes.
successful on the ground. um, what kind of technology is utilized, who's the operator, whether the operator understands how to run such a service
Mm.
or not, right?
Right.
So the first step is demystifying the issue. The second step is operationalizing
Yeah.
the solution.
Is there an ecosystem of vendors willing and able to offer parking management services to cities in South Asia, or is that really just very nascent at the moment?
So there are a whole bunch of vendors who are doing off-street parking management at say malls, airports, and
Mm.
such, right? So that ecosystem has come up fairly well because pretty much every mall in India has parking pricing and hourly parking pricing and fairly steep pricing actually at that. An interesting case study that we've seen in Chennai, we will be putting it out on our website soon, is that around some of the malls of Chennai, a lot of smaller private operators have come up who open parking lots at slightly cheaper prices than what the mall charges. So giving people an alternative, a cheaper alternative if they are
Interesting.
interested in. And they've been quite successful. So here, two private sector operators are essentially fighting each other. One formal established mall and the other is informal, smaller operators
Okay.
around the mall.
But on-street parking management capable of supplying to a city like Chennai a package of payment via app, demarcating the streets, enforcement, that ecosystem is not developed yet.
That's right. That ecosystem is not developed. I know that Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation tied up with somebody to also create an app where they've had some degree of success, but it's not quite ready for prime time.
Okay, so watch this space. International parking reform vendors, listen up. There's a huge opportunity in South Asia, an enormous unmet demand. But I think we might leave it at that. Did you want to end with any parting words of encouragement for listeners who may be wanting to work on parking reform?
Yes, especially if the listener is a city official, and I hope city officials are listening into this podcast. They must. I think this is a fantastic resource. The good news is that probably your citizens are willing to pay more than what you're willing to charge. So be a little brave, courageous, and go out,
Mm.
and you'd be surprised how much more people are willing to pay. So go start implementing parking management. Ensure that parking fees on the streets are high enough to nudge people to privately operated parking structures off street. And the other important thing that we found is that there is a lot of unutilized off street supply that's available,
Right.
which has been created because of existing parking minimums,
Yes.
which people, if you provide an ecosystem, an app which allows people to know where this parking is and how much they're supposed to pay, you might unlock a huge amount of off-street parking supply.
Several things you've said today have surprised me, and I've learned something, so I'm very grateful for that. One of them was related to what you just mentioned about the entrepreneurship that is emerging. I've often talked about this, that if we get the parking policies in the street right and the public sector, the cities manage their own parking well, we can relax a little bit because people will find all sorts of innovative ways to deal with their parking issues, and entrepreneurs will step up. And to some extent, we could point to various examples around the world. Japan is a great example of that. But to some extent, in a place like India, I was just hoping for the best and are slightly worried that maybe lots of red tape would be getting in the way. But you've mentioned several examples of cases where entrepreneurs already are stepping up, and very promising signs that they will do so more if we can just get this public sector on-street parking management in order.
Precisely. And imagine if they're doing it even without on-street
Yes.
parking management, if the market's already taking off, imagine how much more can happen if we get on-street parking right.
Yeah. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, Shreya. I'm really grateful that you managed to take the time. You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.